To prevent Hamas from rebuilding itself, Israel has prevented those police officers who were associated with Hamas prior to the war. They have prevented them from putting feet on the ground. But Israel has also delayed the creation of any other alternative Palestinian law enforcement agency. This is one of the reasons why Benjamin Netanyahu's plan has been criticized, that there is no effective day-after-war plan which Israel has drawn up or agreed to. But there's also domestic politics at play in Israel. Benny Gantz, who is the main opposition leader and who's now part of the wartime cabinet, has made a solo trip to Washington this week. He was there Monday and Tuesday. While he was in Washington, he's met with US Vice President Kamala Harris and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. This comes even as there are obvious differences between Israel and the United States on how to handle the fallout of this war. Biden and Netanyahu clearly cannot see eye to eye on many issues, most pressingly the timeline and the details of a ceasefire deal. Biden last week said he was singularly positive that a ceasefire would be in place by the start of this week. That unfortunately has not come to pass just yet. Biden has previously characterized Israel's response as over the top. Now there are reports ahead of Gantz's visit to Washington that his trip at this stage of the war is not approved by the Prime Minister. Gantz reportedly was told by Netanyahu that there's only one Prime Minister in the country, and that is Netanyahu. Gantz joined the wartime cabinet after the October 7th attacks. He is best placed to win elections if one were to be held today in Israel. This is also America's way of signaling to Netanyahu and his hard-right coalition partners on whom his government is dependent that they are open to looking at alternative political options if Netanyahu and his government are not willing to play ball with Washington. And keeping this in mind, the White House is also keeping up the pressure on Israel. Vice President Kamala Harris on Sunday called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, saying that both Hamas and Israel should agree to a 6-week pause that is currently being negotiated. That's currently the only deal on the table. She also argued that Israel should increase the flow of aid into Gaza, where there is clearly a humanitarian crisis. Israel has currently not sent any delegation to Cairo, where officials from Egypt, Qatar, and the United States are trying to hammer out a temporary peace deal. They are hoping to do that by the start of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, which begins on the 10th of March. Mediators say that Israel has more or less accepted the terms of the deal, but Hamas has yet to agree to it. It is stuck on a principal point that Israel feels too many Palestinian prisoners who've been accused of grave crimes have to be let go of, have to be released in exchange for some of the hostages who are still in Hamas captivity. Israel has also separately asked Hamas for a list of all those hostages who are currently alive, which Hamas has refused to share up until now. So hanging in this balance of a potential ceasefire deal, a visit by the main opposition leader who's now part of the wartime cabinet to Washington, clearly differences cropping up between Netanyahu and the Biden administration, it is going to be interesting to watch how the politics of this war defines the rest of Israel's response as we see it in the next few weeks and months ahead.
Co-presented by JK Tyre Ranger Series. Stay wild at heart. Co-powered by AU Small Finance Bank. बदलाव हमसे है.
Hello, Namaskar. This is First Post and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. China is preparing for war, says who? Beijing itself. Their president keeps telling his army to get ready, and now their premier is talking about taking Taiwan by force. That too in the country's parliament. Their economy is in bad shape. Entire industries need rescue packages, but the only thing they're boosting is their defense spending. What do we make of these moves and statements? We'll discuss that tonight. Meanwhile, the Maldives has signed a defense deal with China. What does that mean for India? And is it linked to India's new military base in Lakshadweep? Why does Iran want a naval base in the Sudan, and why have they turned down that request? Why are Indian app makers complaining to the government about Google? What's the human hair smuggling racket busted in India? How is it linked to China? France is the first country to make abortion a constitutional right. What's the politics behind this move? Why is Cuba, the land of Fidel Castro and cigars, making news for powdered milk? Why is Zimbabwe selling the latest US sanctions as a foreign policy win? What's the $12 billion scam that has taken Vietnam by storm, and how fast fashion is getting faster, and which governments are trying to apply brakes? All this and more coming up. The headlines first. Hamas says Gaza ceasefire talks extended for another day. Israel has stayed away from the negotiations being held in Cairo, Egypt. There has been no breakthrough in the talks, which began 2 days ago. Reports say mediators are now waiting for Israel's response to Hamas's proposal. The chief of the United Nations atomic watchdog to head to Russia, Rafael Grossi, will hold talks with President Putin about the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, the largest in Europe. In 2022, Russia captured it from Ukraine. Both Moscow and Kiev have accused each other of compromising the plant's safety. In India, the BJP launches a scathing attack on the DMK after its leader A. Raja says India is not a country but a subcontinent. Also claims the people of Tamil Nadu won't accept slogans praising Lord Ram. The DMK's India bloc allies, including the Congress party, distance themselves from these controversial remarks. Iran executed at least 834 people last year, the highest since 2015. Compared to 2022, the number in 2023 was higher by 43%. It's only the second time in 2 decades that more than 800 executions took place in a year. Human rights groups have accused Tehran of using the death penalty to spread fear. 2 planes collide mid-air over the Nairobi National Park in Kenya. A student pilot and trainer have been killed after their aircraft crashed into a passenger plane, but over 40 others managed to escape unhurt. The cause of the collision is not yet clear. And Montenegro halts the extradition of crypto fugitive Do Kwon to the US. Last year, the Terraform founder was arrested in Montenegro after being on the run for months. Both South Korea and the US are seeking Kwon's extradition. In 2022, his company collapsed, wiping out around $40 billion of investors' money. Is China preparing for war? Will it invade Taiwan and take over the island by force? We've asked this question many times on the show, but today Beijing has given its clearest signal. It is spoiling for a fight. Today, China declared that it wants reunification with Taiwan, and it wants to, quote unquote, be firm in doing so. Now, this is a major shift because in the past, China has phrased this differently. It used to say it wants a peaceful reunification with Taiwan. The word peaceful has now been replaced with firm by this man, Li Qiang. He's China's premier. Less than a year into office, he delivered an address to China's rubber stamp parliament today, presented his annual report and peppered it with some tough talk on Taiwan. Listen to this.
We must persist in implementing the party's overall strategy for resolving the Taiwan issue in the new era, adhere to the One China principle and the 1992 consensus, resolutely oppose Taiwan separatism and foreign interference.
This is not just a hollow threat. It comes with a bigger military budget. This year, Beijing will boost its defense spending. By how much? A little over 7%. So what is the budget for 2024? $231 billion. The budget for the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, this year, $231 billion. It is the biggest increase in 5 years. And these are the numbers which China chooses to reveal. Ask any expert and they'll tell you that the actual figure is higher. China often ends up overspending on its military. There are parts of the military budget which are kept secret, Like the spending on research and development, they do not declare it to the world. Last week, the US flagged concerns. It's been worried about China's growing military capabilities. America believes the threat from China is growing. It is entering new battlegrounds, including space. Japan, too, is concerned.
China continues to increase its defense spending at a high level and is rapidly expanding its military capabilities across a wide range of areas without sufficient transparency.
So the PLA gets more money this year. More money means more weapons, more gear. A bigger PLA also means more expansionism. And that's the goal of Xi Jinping. He keeps asking his troops to prepare for war, and now he wants to arm them for that war. Taipei is watching this with concern and stepping up its defenses. Today, their defense minister spoke about this. He said Taiwan would have more missile drills this year. And they're not the only ones bracing for Chinese misadventures. The Philippines, too, is on guard and at the receiving end of China's bullying. There was another incident today. Chinese and Philippine coast guards clashed. Chinese ships engaged in dangerous maneuvers. They bumped into ships from Manila. There were 2 collisions in all. Both sides deployed water cannons. There were injuries on the Philippine side. So China seems to be intent on keeping its many territorial disputes alive. Which brings us back to the Premier's speech. It's an annual event. Usually the world tunes into it for insights into the Chinese economy and their plans for the years ahead. And this time, the economy is a sore point for them. Here's what Li said about it.
The main expected development goals for this year are a GDP growth of around 5%, more than 12 million new urban jobs, a registered urban unemployment rate of around 5.5%, a rise of around 3% in consumer price index, synchronous growth of household income and economic growth, and basic balance of international payments.
Now, those are some ambitious targets. Beijing is promising growth. The Premier says he wants to boost the economy, but he doesn't say how. How will he do it? China's economy faces a host of problems. Growth has tanked. There is rampant unemployment. Among the youth, it's so bad that China has stopped publishing unemployment data. There is a crisis in the property sector. Since 2021, 40% of home sellers in China have defaulted. 40%. Chinese stock markets are in a state of decline. In the last 12 months, they've fallen by 20%. The Indian stock market has surpassed Hong Kong. All these ailing sectors need bailouts. But China won't rescue them. It is more focused on building the PLA, on preparing for war. Even if Xi Jinping manages to subdue a small neighbor to boost his ego, it will be a Pyrrhic victory. It's not all coercion, though. Some countries are willfully falling into China's trap, like the Maldives. Yesterday, we told you about President Mohammad Muizzu's choice. Does he repair ties with India or does he ally with China? Well, we spoke too soon because Muizzu has made his choice. He has signed a defense agreement with China. A defense deal with China. What does it say? In typical Chinese style, it's all secret. We know just 2 things about this deal. One, it allows China to provide military assistance to the Maldives, and 2, it's free of cost. Now, assistance is a broad term. Does it mean giving weapons or military aid? Does it mean sending surveillance technology? Does it mean deploying Chinese officials, or does it mean all of the above? Unless you specify, people will assume the worst. But then again, maybe that's Muizzu's plan. Look at the chronology of events. First, he asked Indian sailors to leave the Maldives. Then he hosted a Chinese spy vessel. Then he sent civilians to replace India sent civilians to replace its soldiers. And now, a defense deal with China. So the message is quite clear. Muizzu sees his future in the Chinese camp. He wants to keep pulling away from India. And his latest statement confirms that. Listen to this. There will be no Indian troops in the country come May 10th, not in uniform and not in civilian clothing. The Indian military will not be residing in this country in any form of clothing. New Delhi has already agreed to that. The soldiers are on their way out. But Muizzu wants to make a spectacle out of it. The question is, how will this affect India's security? And how can New Delhi respond? Some basics first. China has been eyeing the Indian Ocean for a long time, through investments, through debt traps, and through alliances. They've been at it. It's been a multi-decade project. And I'll show you the result on this map. These are all the Chinese bases or ports in the Indian Ocean. First is Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. It has a PLA military base. Then you have Gwadar in Pakistan, built and operated by China. Down south, you have Hambantota in Sri Lanka. China has a 99-year lease on it. Finally, we come to Myanmar. China is building a port in the city of Kyayukpyu. Now, these are the major projects. If you add investments and financing, it's a lot more. Some 21 Chinese ports in the Indian Ocean. Experts call this China's string of pearls. Now, the question is, will the Maldives become the latest pearl? Will it host a Chinese port or base? Honestly, we can't rule it out, which is why India is making its own moves. We told you about one such move last week. India and Mauritius inaugurated an airstrip and jetty on Agalega. It's a northern island of Mauritius. India invested some $192 million there. Now, don't confuse it for a military base, because India is not China. But it does give New Delhi some strategic advantage, like information exchange or surveillance missions or joint patrols. And India isn't done yet. On Wednesday, the Indian Navy is commissioning a new base. It's called the INS Jatayu. It's located on Lakshadweep's Minicoy Islands. Another project is on Androt. It's an eastern island of Lakshadweep. The plan is to build a new jetty there, one that can host bigger ships. So what's the end game here? What is India trying to do with these bases and airstrips? Listen to what the Navy is saying. With the commissioning of the INS Jatayu, the Indian Navy will strengthen its foothold in the Lakshadweep Islands and extend operational surveillance, reach, and sustenance. Let me underline two words here: surveillance and reach. That's what Lakshadweep can offer India. It is located around 400 kilometers from the mainland, sort of like a permanent aircraft carrier, a launch pad to track and deter enemies. It will be crucial in the coming years and decades. China is building a massive fleet of warships. It also has a willing partner in President Muizu. If you combine the two, it means trouble for India. We may be looking at the Indian Ocean status, a new status quo in the Indian Ocean, one where India and the Maldives are in opposing camps. And speaking of foreign bases, reports say Iran wanted one in the Sudan. Just one problem though, the Sudanese government has said no, which also raises some questions like, do Iran and the Sudan get along? Why did Iran want a base in that country, and why did the Sudan say no? First, some geography. The Sudan is located in northeastern Africa, just south of Egypt. It has a pretty long coastline along the Red Sea, some 750 kilometers of it, and that's what Iran reportedly wanted. A naval base on the Red Sea. That's what Iran wanted. Two reasons why. Number one, Iran's rivals already have access to the Red Sea, like Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt. All of them can access the Red Sea, but Iran cannot. It is located on the other side of the Persian Gulf, so it wants this access. Reason number two, to weaponize maritime trade. You see, Yemen's Houthis are already doing it. They've been attacking commercial ships in the Red Sea. And who supports the Houthis? The Iranian regime. So Tehran knows how important this route is, how it can scare world powers. Maybe that's why Tehran wants a base there, to keep tabs on rivals, to coordinate with the Houthis, and to check Western powers. But why did the Sudan turn them down? They said no to Iran. Reports say Iran offered them a sweet deal, a helicopter carrier in exchange for a naval base. But the Sudan feared a Western backlash. Let me explain this. Until 2019, the Sudan was ruled by an Islamist dictator. His name was Omar al-Bashir. He was quite close to Iran. But that year, 2019, a military coup toppled him. Sudan's generals captured power, and they kept Iran at a distance. They wanted to repair relations with the West. Just consider the Abraham Accords. In 2021, the Sudan decided to recognize Israel. In return, they got relief from the United States. The Sudan was removed from the terror watch list. It was also given $1.2 billion in loans, so the generals played along. If they side with the West, they get more benefits. If they side with Iran, they do not. So it's a simple strategic call. Of course, that may change in the future because the Sudan's regime is in trouble. They're fighting a civil war, the army versus the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. It's the country's main paramilitary group. Now, the generals need weapons to fight these rebels. If not, they could lose. And guess who is ready to offer that support? Iran. They've already sold some weapons to the Sudan. So my point is quite simple. The current Red Sea equation is not permanent. The generals can still change sides, meaning Iran can still get a port in the Red Sea. And what would that mean? Possibly more chaos. The Houthis alone have been a handful. Last week, they sunk a British commercial ship. It was hit by 2 Houthi missiles in February. The damages eventually sank the ship. Then yesterday, 3 undersea fiber optic cables were damaged. And this is serious. Undersea cables are the lifeline of the internet. All of us use it. Assume that you're browsing an American web page. Chances are it's hosted on a US server. So how are you browsing it in India or Africa or wherever you are? Because your internet provider is using these cables. They transmit data across countries and continents. If you cut these undersea cables, you can disrupt the internet. And that's what has happened now. 25% internet traffic between Asia and Europe has been impacted. Companies are racing to find solutions. So I guess the question is, who cut these cables? The Houthis have not claimed responsibility yet, but clearly they are the prime suspects. Because on Monday they attacked another ship, the MSC Sky.
Triumphing over the oppressed Palestinian people and in retaliation for the American-British aggression against our country, the naval forces of the Yemeni armed forces carried out a targeting operation against an Israeli ship, MSC Sky, in the Arabian Sea with several suitable naval missiles, and the hit was accurate and direct.
Guess who helped out the ship? The Indian Navy. The INS Kolkata arrived at the attack site late on Monday. Then this morning, firefighting began. 12 Indian personnel were involved in the mission. Take a look. So is this the new normal? I ask because the Houthis seem to like it. They now want ships to obtain permits, to take their permission, maybe pay them some money, and then sail through the Red Sea. It's a very dangerous trend. At first, the Houthis said their goal was to deter Israel, to stop the war in Gaza. That's what they wanted, they said. Once the war stopped, so would the attacks. But what if the Houthis changed their plans? After all, this tactic is giving them a lot of attention and money. So what if the Houthis stick to it? That's the new headache for world powers. Back to India now, and there's a showdown in the world of technology. Google versus Indian app developers. It all started last Friday. Around 200 Indian apps were removed from Google's Play Store. You may know some of them, like Naukri, 99 Acres, Shiksha, Shadi.com, Kuku FM. The reason was Google's new payments policy. Now, I'm guessing all of you know what in-app payments are. In-app payments. Sometimes apps have premium features or extra services. And to access them, you need to make payments inside that app, hence the name in-app payments. Now, Google wanted to charge for these transactions, for these payments. How much? Between 11 and 26%. Google wanted that cut, 11 to 26%, but the app developers opposed it. They pointed to other payment gateways in India like Razorpay or Cashfree. Guess how much they charge? Between 0 and 4%. Google wanted up to 26%, so app developers questioned Google's policy. And they refused to comply. Soon the government got involved, the government of India. The IT minister held talks with the developers and Google. And he agreed to find a solution. These developers also approached India's antitrust watchdog. It's called the CCI, the Competition Commission of India. And what was their complaint? They said Google was exploiting its dominant position, that it was causing irreparable harm to the market. And looks like the pressure worked. Because Google is now making a U-turn, it has relisted all the Indian apps. It says it will wait for the Supreme Court of India to settle the matter. So time out for now. But this controversy does raise a few questions. One, does Google have a case here? And two, why are we so dependent on them? Google's Play Store is basically a market, a place where you can buy and get apps. It's also a monopoly. Technically, you can get apps from other markets, like the Galaxy Store or the Huawei App Gallery or the Vivo App Store, but none of them are popular. If you use Android, you use the Play Store. And that gives Google a lot of power. The question is, are they exploiting that powerful position? Here's what the company says. More than 200,000 Indian developers, 2 lakh Indian developers have already agreed to the new billing system. Only 10 holdouts remained. Those companies and their apps got removed, those 10. Google also says the fee is negligible. Only 3% Indian developers use in-app payments. Most of them are charged under 15%. Only 60 developers, 60, pay more than that, more than 15%. Now, I know these numbers seem quite small, certainly not enough to get the government of India involved. But this is not about numbers. This is about principle. Should a company be allowed to exploit its dominant position? In an ideal world, no. But we need to ask ourselves an important question. How did we get here? Why are we so dependent on Google? That is the root of the problem. Almost 95% smartphones in India run on Google's operating system, what we call Android. 95% phones in India, chances are all of them use the Play Store. So if you make an app in India, you are at the mercy of Google. You can complain on social media, you can reach out to ministers, but at the end of the day, Google holds all the cards. In fact, they kicked off this race. Google launched the Play Store way back in 2012. It has a 12-year head start. Logic says it's impossible to bridge that gap. But some companies are trying, like PhonePe. PhonePe has launched its own app store. It's called the Indus App Store. And its biggest feature? No fees for in-app payments. Now, I know it sounds great on paper, but the challenge ahead is huge. All Android phones come preloaded with Play Store. Users are hardwired to search for it. So we're talking about a massive behavioral change here, one that could take lots of time and money, which is why companies are wary of this market. You could call it a digital mission impossible. It doesn't mean we can't learn lessons from it. These controversies show why homegrown platforms are so important. You can hold them accountable. You can enforce your laws. Just look at the same Google in the US. Their CEO is one of the biggest names in tech. But in the US Senate, he's grilled like a teenager. He sits patiently and he takes questions. Why? Because Google is based in the US. It's an American company. India needs to start thinking like that. Maybe it's too late for social media or search engines, but not for new technologies like artificial intelligence. You need to identify and promote such new industries. If not, you will fall behind again. Now, let me ask you what may sound like a strange question. Have you ever wondered what happens to your hair after a haircut? The strands that have been cut, what happens to them? They're trash for you. But for hair traders, it's gold, especially in India. Because there's massive demand overseas for Indian human hair. And guess who is among the biggest buyers? China. In fact, they're so keen on this supply that they have started or resorted to smuggling. Human hair from India, that's what they're smuggling. This week, Indian officials cracked a big case. They found hair worth over $1 billion being smuggled, mostly to China. India's border forces have been seizing a lot of these shipments lately. Our next report tells you why this has become a hair-raising issue.
On the face of it, it may sound amusing, but India's border forces are confronting a hairy situation. This isn't mere wordplay, it's the reality. There's widespread smuggling of human hair out of India. India's Enforcement Directorate has been probing a new case. This is the agency tasked with investigating money laundering cases. They've exposed a smuggling operation. It involves shipping human hair out of the country illegally. Well, hair may seem like a waste when you go to your barber for a haircut, but overseas, it's worth a lot of money. The operation uncovered by the ED involved smuggling of human hair worth $1 billion. And guess who's the biggest buyer? China, followed by other countries like Bangladesh, Myanmar and Vietnam. The smuggling often happens through land routes running through India's neighbouring countries. Human hair export is a big business. Going by one claim, India accounts for 80% of the world's hair exports. That's a big number, which is also the reason behind the deeper scrutiny. A simple Google search exposes the magnitude of the problem. Most of these stories have one thing in common. The bulk of the demand comes from China. So why do the Chinese want to get their hands on Indian hair? Well, there are a few compelling reasons. There's an epidemic of hair loss in China. There are many Chinese who are losing their hair at a very young age. And it's not just the men. In 2020, over 250 million Chinese were diagnosed with hair loss, and out of this, 88 million were women. This has led to an uptick in the demand for wigs and hair extensions, and manufacturers prefer Indian hair. They describe it as lightweight, lustrous, wavy and bouncy. In fact, India is famous for its supply of Remy hair. That's the type with the cuticles still all in one piece. They are believed to be of the finest quality. Where do they come from? Usually from a single source. Many traders gather these from temples in southern India where women are known to shave their heads for religious reasons. But like in any business, the hair exports too suffer from a demand and supply problem. The supply for human hair is hard to come by, so the Chinese have resorted to smuggling. Last year, it was revealed the Chinese buyers were hiring local agents who bought human hair from Indian suppliers and smuggled them out of the country. India is now cracking down hard on this problem. The illegal supply is also a loss for the exchequer as the smugglers end up avoiding any export tax. The problem is a messy one and it may take a while to untangle.
Vantage continues after a short break.
Till 10th, right. It is not being followed. 21 is the age for marriage. It is not followed. There is a heavy child labor there. There is nobody to work towards it from the government perspective or from MPG's perspective. This is one side of the atrocities happening on the Muslim women community itself. Now coming up to Hindu people, it is extremely difficult for Hindus there to have their survival because they lack safety and security. Right. So they need somebody who could strongly stand up for that. And you know how people judge there whether their leader is strong or not? They judge that whether this leader can take the voice of having truthful elections all the way to the Central Election Commission. Right. I am going to represent the Central Election Commission. All the things that are happening behind the screen in polling and during the election time. This is only how a leader is being chosen and judged here. They see that whether she can stand up bravely to the expectations of the voter. Voter wants a change here. But they can only bring up this change provided you give them the justified way of executing their vote right. And that's very important. They want development. Who would not want development, Anandji? Who would not want to have development when the entire world, even countries, Middle East, if you look at Dubai, most of these Muslims do definitely go once in a while to Dubai and come back on, on search of jobs. They do get really disappointed. Okay, why are we like this here? हमारा जिंदगी क्यों यहाँ पे ऐसा है? उनका क्यों वैसा वहाँ पे है? But they have no, I would say, they don't have the guts to speak it up.
She's a dancer, she's a philanthropist, she's a social worker, and now she's going to go head on against Asaduddin Owaisi in the old city of Hyderabad. Joining us now is Madhavi Lataji. Namaste, Jai Hind. Congratulations on being nominated. Your first thought, the first lady to be put up from that seat in many, many years, perhaps even in the records. Never has a woman contested from the old city, Hyderabad. Tough one or not? Madhviji.
Because I'm born and brought up there, Anandji, so I definitely know the logistics there. I know the truth that is prevailing there, and I know the desperation of the people who are living in that constituency. So I just don't see any tough fight as such for myself there.
Well, you don't see a tough fight, but the numbers speak otherwise, Madhviji. The seat dominated by the Owaisis, Salahuddin Owaisi and then Asaduddin Owaisi since 1984. 2019 also had a victory of more than 230,000 votes.
I do agree, Anandji, but I would say that then I was just a kid. So I would only talk what is exactly today. Today the perspective is that we cannot anymore take the religion as the X factor to win elections. The days have gone. People have modernized themselves. People have understood that religion is a very personal thing that keeps us always happy and wise to think for the better development of the nation. Agar Asad ji would continuously want to use that as his X factor to win, I am sure that that's...
As humans, we are entitled to some basic rights. Right to life, right to education, right to work, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. These are some of our basic rights. But here's the contentious one. The right to abortion. It should be a basic right, one that all women should have. But more often than not, it's a flashpoint. France decided to change that. It has made abortion a constitutional right. The first country in the world to do so. 902 French lawmakers voted on the bill, 780 voted in favor of it, 72 voted against it and 50 abstained, so it was passed with an overwhelming majority. Supporters cheered on the streets. President Macron called it French pride. The Eiffel Tower lit up in celebration. It sparkled with the message, "My body, my choice." It's a proud moment for France, and why wouldn't it be? Worldwide, abortion rights are under attack. In 24 countries, it's illegal for women to get an abortion. In 37 countries, it's heavily restricted. The US overturned the right to abortion in 2022. Since then, several states have banned it. You must cross state borders to get an abortion in America. In Europe, Poland cracked down on abortion rights. It outlawed it in many cases. Hungary has tightened abortion laws. Latin America has regressive anti-abortion laws. Africa has the highest death rate when it comes to unsafe abortions. It's illegal in Laos and the Philippines. And in the midst of all of this, France is like a shining beacon. But did Paris do this to protect women's rights? Or was it purely political? Let's look at the facts. France legalized abortion in 1975. It was allowed until 10 weeks of pregnancy. In 2001, it was extended to 12 weeks. In 2022, extended to 14 weeks. You could get an abortion up to 14 weeks into your pregnancy. The procedure was covered by the country's health system. And it's been like that since the 1980s. Plus, there's strong support for it. 86% French citizens favor abortion rights. Even among the right wing, it's quite popular. Before the vote, the French Prime Minister said the right to abortion was in danger. But data shows that was not the case. Since 1975, France's abortion law has been updated 9 times, and every time access has only been expanded. The people support it, the lawmakers support it. Across the political spectrum, they all want abortion to be legal in France. Of course, enshrining it in the constitution is a great move. But why now? Why did they do it now? Among other things, it makes political sense. President Macron lacks majority in the National Assembly. He passed laws on immigration, on pension reforms. They were vastly unpopular. The left panned him. The right said it wasn't enough. But abortion rights, well, they are like the great unifier. Most lawmakers support the law. It boosts popularity, and technically, it doesn't change very much on the ground. In France, the right to abortion was already enshrined in the law. It was already a right. So on the ground, nothing changes except for Macron. This move boosts his credentials. He's now the French president who protected abortion rights, which brings us to the politics of abortion. The world over, it is a political tool. In the US, Republican states banned abortion because it suited their voter base. Joe Biden is defending it because it's important for his voters, the Democrats. Poland outlawed it when the right wing was in power. Now the new prime minister wants to overturn it because that's what suits him. So across the world, women's bodies are a political battleground. Lawmakers don't see it as a choice or a right. So women can't make decisions on their reproductive health themselves. More than 40% women in the world can't take those decisions. More than 200 million have no access to contraception, and more than 1 million are denied abortion. When you see France's move against this backdrop, you know that it's just symbolic. Yes, it is important. It's personal for many women. But the fact is, it's also political, like any other abortion verdict in the world. Our next story is from Cuba. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you say Cuba? Cigars? Fidel Castro, perhaps? Those are the popular guesses. But have you heard about the Cuban economy? It's been in the headline for some time now. Cuba has raised its fuel prices by 500%. It cancelled its annual May Day parade because of shortage of fuel. It is asking the World Food Programme for powdered milk. There's a shortage of food, there's a shortage of medicines, and this isn't a new crisis. It's been going on for decades now. Our next report tells you how Cuba went from being the shining beacon in Latin America to a struggling economy.
It was the early 1960s. The CIA was busy with Operation Mongoose. America wanted to kill Fidel Castro. They hatched different plans, 33 of them. Some included the usual, like poisoning, hiring hitmen. But some of those plans were downright bizarre, like using a nuclear-tipped cigar. Sounds like the CIA drew inspiration from cartoons. Obviously, the plans did not work. The CIA tried and tried, but Castro had more lives than a cat. So his cigars stayed, as did his revolutionary speeches. If you ask anyone, Fidel Castro is synonymous with Cuba. The world knows him as Castro, but for Cubans, he was just Fidel. He was loved by some, hated by many, but no one could ignore him. His beard was recognizable anywhere, so much so that a CIA plan was to make his beard fall out. America believed it would make people lose respect for him and lead to his ouster. That did not happen. Castro was the longest-serving non-royal leader of the 20th century. His rule spanned that of 10 US presidents. Castro believed Cuba's problems were because of capitalism. He wanted a people's revolution. So, in 1953, he planned an armed uprising. It was against Fulgencio Batista. He was arrested, he left Cuba, but returned to lead a guerrilla campaign. And in 1959, Castro finally got what he wanted, to rule over Cuba. It was a contentious rule. He was close to the Soviet Union, thus enemy number one for the US. The country hosted Soviet missiles. In 1962, the world was on the brink of an all-out nuclear war, with a small island at the center of it. There were also some remarkable achievements, especially in the domestic sphere. Medical care was free for all. Infant mortality rates were at par with developed nations. Cuba even sent doctors and nurses abroad. Cuban doctors conducted over 2 million cataract operations worldwide. They were all paid by the government in Havana. The country also had an advanced biotech industry. Food rationing was introduced in the 1960s. Basic food necessities like rice, oil and beans are available to all. That too at heavily subsidized prices. It was a policy lauded by many. But with the US embargo and no Soviet lifeline in the 80s, it just wasn't sustainable. There was chronic shortage. Department stores had empty shelves. Food queues grew. People wanted to leave the country. It continued until the early 2000s. That's when Fidel Castro relented. He introduced some free market reforms, but it didn't change much on the ground. Then came his brother, Raul Castro. Raul preferred the free market more. In 2008, personal computers were sold to the general public for the first time ever in the country. But the reforms came too little too late. In the 2010s, the economy was still struggling. Then came the pandemic, and since then, the nation of 11 million has barely recovered. Inflation is at 30%. Last year, the economy shrank by 2%, and this year looks no better. Cuba has hiked fuel prices by 500%. There's a shortage of milk, medicines, and other food items, which is why Cuba is now asking the World Food Programme for powdered milk. Cuba blames the US sanctions for the crisis. But government mismanagement over many decades is equally to be blamed. Fidel Castro may be long gone, but his policies continue to loom over the island. Cuba was once a crowning jewel in Latin America, but it lost its sheen long ago and is struggling to find a way back.
Now let's look at what the US government is up to. Yesterday was fairly standard. New day, new sanctions, normal American Monday blues. Their target was an old favorite, Zimbabwe. It's a country in southern Africa. It's home to about 17 million people, and they've seen it all. For decades, the country was under the iron fist of Robert Mugabe, a freedom fighter turned dictator. Sadly, a common story. He ruled for 30 years, then planned to hand over power to his wife, but in 2017, he was ousted in a coup. Instead of his wife, his vice president took over, continuing the cycle of single-party rule and oppression, just with a different face in charge. As you can tell, the country has been through a lot, including American sanctions. Zimbabwe has been subjected to them for decades now, especially their political class. Washington accuses Zimbabwe's ruling party, the ZANU-PF, of corruption, political repression, and other standard autocratic behavior. These sanctions have never had their desired effect. As I said, Zimbabwe continues to be run by the same party, the ZANU-PF. So we keep hearing stories about rigged elections and dead opposition figures. No matter what the US has tried, they remain a constant. This may remind you of the old adage, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But believe it or not, this time it is different. The US decided to fine-tune its sanctions. Instead of carpet bombing, they went for a precision strike approach, restricting the sanctions to just the top brass and bringing relief to many unfairly targeted people. The latest sanctions target just 11 individuals and 3 companies in Zimbabwe. Most of these people were already on the list, like Zimbabwe's president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, Mugabe's vice president, who is now the man in charge. He is accused of ordering the political repression and of abetting corruption on a grand scale. Look at the US Treasury Department's accusations. They say the president provides protection to gold and diamond smugglers. He is accused of taking bribes to allow them to smuggle precious minerals out of the country and sell them in quote-unquote illicit markets. Zimbabwe's president is also accused of misappropriating state assets and corruption in handing out government contracts. This is why the US has kept him under sanctions. There are also other government officials on the list, like one of the country's vice presidents and the defense minister. They're there for political repression. That's what they're accused of. The new inductees include the First Lady of Zimbabwe, Auxilia Mnangagwa. She's accused of facilitating her husband's corruption. Then there are some shady businessmen and their companies and some police officials, so standard stuff there. But again, this list is very precise. Like I said, just 11 people and 3 firms. The US has actually removed more sanctions than it has imposed. Removed them from dozens of companies and individuals in Zimbabwe, bringing relief to hundreds of people in the country. The Deputy Secretary of the US Treasury, Wally Adeyemo, has said this, and I'm quoting, "The changes we are making today are intended to make clear what has always been true. Our sanctions are not intended to target the people of Zimbabwe." That is why this no longer seems like insanity. The approach, like we said, has changed. American sanctions no longer threaten ordinary people, and Zimbabwe's government is calling this a victory. Even though their president is under sanctions, they say this is a vindication of his foreign policy. Talk about turning a defeat into a celebration, though they're still upset. One government spokesperson said this, that as long as the first family is under sanctions, all of Zimbabwe remains under sanctions, which is not true though. The president and his wife will still feel the pinch, but many ordinary citizens will get relief. They no longer have to pay for the crimes of their political overlords. They never should have had to. It was always a mistake, but at least that has been rectified now. So hopefully America will stick by this new, less insane approach. When you hear the word scam, what do you think of? These days, cryptocurrency perhaps, the fall of FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried, or maybe Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. Our more seasoned viewers may remember Bernie Madoff, WorldCom, or the biggest scandal of all, Enron. But massive scams are not exclusive to the US. As in all other spheres, Asia is catching up. Today, a trial began in Vietnam in a $12.5 billion scam, a real estate scam involving a woman called Truong My Lan. She's a 67-year-old real estate tycoon who began selling cosmetics at the age of 16 and went on to control 90% of a bank and a real estate empire. Today, she was brought before a court in Vietnam in what's being called their trial of the century. Here's our report.
Chức vụ gì trong Ngân hàng Thương mại Cổ phần Sài Gòn (SCB). Thế nhưng với việc nắm giữ
Vietnamese state-run television is being kind. They've decided to blur the face of Truong My Lan, even though she's quite famous in the country. After all, she's one of the richest people there. She made her fortune in the world of real estate, and now she's on trial. Why? Because her fortune was apparently built on a million lies. Truong My Lan stands accused of orchestrating one of, if not the biggest scam in Vietnam's history. The scam amounts to almost $12.5 billion, more than FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried, more than double Malaysia's 1MDB scam. The scandal is one of the biggest in all of Asia, and if proven guilty, the tycoon risks getting the death penalty. So let's look at how this happened. Lan founded the VTP Group real estate company in 1991. She was among a host of developers building high-end commercial and residential properties in Vietnam. As her company kept growing, she needed more money to fund new projects. She often got this in the form of loans from banks. One bank in particular stands out, the Saigon Joint Stock Commercial Bank. SCB, as it's known, disbursed loans worth $43 billion to Lan and her associates. This was between 2012 and 2022. 2012 was the year the bank was formed. The same year, Lan became a shareholder there. Now, you may wonder, how can a bank give that much money to one party, even if they're a shareholder? After all, the bank gives loans using customer deposits, so there must have been some checks and balances, right? Well, there usually are, but not when one party owns 90% of the bank. It turns out Lan had a network of 27 individuals who owned shares in the bank on her behalf. It allowed her to control the bank and control how it spent its money. A lot of it went into buying bonds from Lan's company, after which it was embezzled. To keep all this under wraps, Lan allegedly paid the people who were supposed to keep watch. Standing trial with her today are 15 State Bank of Vietnam officials, 3 government inspectors, and a former official at the State Audit Office. Together, they had managed to keep Vietnam's government in the dark for almost 10 years, until 2022. That was when Lan was finally arrested. But even then, Vietnamese authorities apparently didn't know about the scale of the scam. They arrested her for some thousands of dollars worth of embezzlement. But that changed when they found a diary belonging to Lan's personal driver. It reportedly contained meticulous notes about the cash he had ferried, amounting to $4.4 billion. Just think about that. There was a man who had spent years driving billions of dollars in cash around the streets of Ho Chi Minh City. The Vietnamese investigators were shocked, and that's when they widened their probe, bringing us to where we are today. The trial is underway. It's expected to last till April. Almost 90% of the people who are involved have been charged in the scam, and some may get the death penalty. Vietnam will hope this trial sends a message. The country has been struggling with corruption for years now, so a harsh sentence in a high-profile case like this may have a ripple effect. But for now, this scam is a stain on Vietnam's reputation, and Hanoi will need to do a lot to restore confidence in the country.
Do you remember what happened in 2008? The world witnessed a global economic crisis. Banking collapsed. Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. Merrill Lynch, AIG, Royal Bank of Scotland, they were about to meet the same fate, but the crisis did not just affect banks. The ramifications were felt across industries, including fashion. Legacy companies filed for bankruptcy. Big brands saw drops in revenue. But do you know who managed to thrive? A new cohort of fashion companies, fast fashion brands. You see, in times of crisis, people do not stop shopping. They just buy more affordable items, like cheap, poorly made clothes. Mass-produced at breakneck speed. So fast fashion made the cut. In 2008, its market share expanded. Companies like Boohoo and ASOS were rolling in profits. We saw this during another crisis as well, the pandemic, when fast fashion mogul Shein made a huge leap. It made $2.5 billion from online sales in 2019, just before the pandemic. By 2020, the number had jumped to $8.4 billion, which is a 236% increase. And fast fashion is still soaring. With cost of living crises and growing unemployment, people are lapping up affordable clothes. The global market for fast fashion is worth $106 billion. $106 billion. By 2027, it is expected to reach $185 billion. But France wants to slow down fast fashion. It has proposed a new bill. Their fast fashion brands will be subject to penalties up to 50% of a garment's selling price. Why? Because France claims that an average brand renews its collection 4 times a year, but fast fashion brands offer thousands of products every day. Shein, for example, offers more than 7,000 new garment models a day. France says this incites excessive spending and creates unnecessary pollution. So it wants to penalize the brands to offset their environmental impact. And France is not wrong. Textile production generates 10% of global carbon emissions, yet 80 billion pieces of new clothing are purchased every year the world over. And what happens to so many clothes? Every 3 in 5 of these items end up in landfills. So why don't consumers reduce the burden? A, because buyers alone cannot change an entire industry, and B, they can't give up on easy, fast, cheap clothes, it seems. So why don't companies change their ways? Because fashion is full of hollow claims about using recycled material or paying fair wages to workers. Most of these promises are made by brands themselves. So their progress is self-reported. And brands go largely unchecked. If they don't meet targets, they don't face punishment. And they do not reform themselves. But change seems to be in the air, and France is not alone here. Over the past few years, governments seem to be waking up to this. A raft of new regulatory proposals and laws have emerged. Last year, the EU banned destruction of unsold clothing, the European Union. The year before, it demanded that companies make long-lasting clothes. And if caught misleading consumers about greenwashing, they would face penalties. Meanwhile, Norway and Germany have due diligence acts. They demand that companies address negative impact on the planet or face hefty fines and operational bans. Britain and the Netherlands do not have such laws, but they're frequently cracking down on greenwashing claims by fast fashion brands. Meanwhile, in the US, New York has proposed the Fashion Act. If passed, it will demand that big clothing companies disclose their supply chains. So labor abuses, greenhouse gases, and chemical use won't remain hidden. So far, the West seems to be leading the charge. Yes, the regulatory changes will be felt across the world, like improved labor conditions and lower pollution levels, but other key players cannot be missing in action, like the global powerhouse of fashion production, which is Asia. Because if not curtailed, fast fashion will only get faster and destroy our world at greater speed. Vantage continues after a short break.
Strength to really stand up for the old city as a constituency and Hyderabad as a old constituency.
But does the dynamics, do the dynamics in Telangana change with the Congress coming back into the fray given the recent Vidhana Sabha polls? Madhaviji, so is it a three-way fight now?
I would no more consider BRS because, as you rightly said, in 2023, in spite of power and money, everything, if they couldn't make it up there, I am sure that it's not possible anymore for them to do it in Hyderabad as Lok Sabha constituency because they have played no good role in ensuring the development of the constituency. For the number of years that they have really ruled here, have taken their role in or responsibility they should have been taken to uplift this particular constituency. They've abandoned it successfully with the sitting MP there. So now coming up to Congress has its own, the way we need to look at it as a party. Now this is a Lok Sabha seat. Congress at center is as good as TRS in the state today.
Okay.
So I don't see any reason why people should be opting for Congress when it comes to Lok Sabha. Now coming up with a third, I would tell you that I'll give you one more dimension to this. In 2023, there has been a very serious fall in the percentage of Muslim votes with AIMIM. At the same time, we also have seen there is a very good increase in entire Telangana, the voting percentage in BJP. While keeping this on one side, what is very important, all of us have to note that Old City as Hyderabad constituency, because I'm sure this is going across the country. Entire nation needs to know one thing. Hyderabad as a Lok Sabha constituency is not Hyderabad as capital city. The capital city of Hyderabad has three constituencies with it, absolutely into the center of it as a capital city. Secunderabad, Malkajgiri and Hyderabad as a different Lok Sabha constituency which has 7 assembly constituencies within that.
Right.
And if you try to compare the Old City Lok Sabha constituency with other 2 constituencies of Hyderabad as capital city, it is in a very pathetic stage.
But let's talk about
development far off. They're actually somewhere in time machine traveling 40 years back.
But let's talk about, you broke the Hyderabad into 3 constituencies, so let's talk about Old City. 7 assembly constituencies there, barring Raja Singh who holds fort in 1, the others are with the AIMIM. So how are you going to breach Old City?
It is going to be different this time because we are going to open up every fact that is behind the polling. The specific and a major reason that he has been winning continuously is because of the support from local government, that is a state government. If you can kindly observe, Anandji, all the years when he has won these elections, you never had BJP in the state.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots. Images that tell the story in Finland. A massive NATO exercise brings together Swedish and Finnish soldiers, both new members of this alliance. In Tokyo, robots deliver food in parts of the city, and Paris unveils official posters for the 2024 Olympic Games with a nod to surrealism. Finally, we are also taking you back in history. On this day in 1946, Winston Churchill fired the opening shot of the Cold War at a college in Missouri. He declared that an Iron Curtain had descended over Europe. In the years that followed, the Iron Curtain symbolized the division between the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc. We're leaving you on that note. Thanks for watching. We will see you tomorrow.